Hi, flower lovers. Rokana and I are here today to talk about the topic of the flower essence making process as a process of spiritual development, as a path. Both of us have independently been making essences for a very long time now. And we have some interesting experiences to tell you about, and just kind of wanted to share our thoughts on this process. It's not one that I find gets a lot of attention. We tend to, especially when you're starting to learn about flower essences, you sort of see them as something that's accomplished and there's a book about it or there's printed information available. But the process that goes on behind the scenes can be fascinating, and it's much it's much messier, I'd have to say, than any sort of description that might show up in a booklet or a website later on. And we wanted to talk about that process and the things that we've learned directly from the plants and how it might impact you in your process of working with and maybe making flower essences. So, welcome. Hey, Ro.
Hey, Kathleen. I love this topic because I've always felt that way with making flower essences, that I get so much out of the process. Uh, I get so much information from the plant that's not just how to use this in a practice, but information and experiences I feel like are helping me grow. They're spurring my own self development in a way that is it's almost like supercharged, right? Um, and I I really there's some aspects to it that I think are sort of unique. They are working with a plant and having a relationship and learning to sort of sit with a plant, communicate it. There are practices that do that. You don't have to be making a flower essence to do that. Um, in fact, I recommend everyone to try that and to sit with the plant and see what comes with that practice. So right there, that in and of itself is a spiritual practice. And yet when we sit and make the essence, there's something else that happens. There's a connection with that higher spirit of the plant, that in this co-creative process, and in a way it's almost sort of like a channeling that's happening. There's a non-ordinary state of reality that's happening, and and something, it's like the plant is taking you on a journey in some way or another, whether you're conscious of it or not. And so all of the things that happen that day leading up to making the plant, making the essence, while making the essence, and then after, and that can last for several days. I don't know about you, Kathleen, but there's sometimes where I just feel the effects of it for a week after that's happening. And sometimes I'll continue to work with the essence and take the essence and really explore it. And sometimes for whatever reason, I don't have time to be that conscious about it. But if I'm at least aware of just circumstances and synchronicities that are happening, I feel like that message keeps coming through.
There's so much in there. I guess I'd go back to the very beginning in that when a plant calls you to make an essence, there's a reason that that plant has something to share with you. That plant has, there's something in you that needs the connection of that plant. I think that the process of making essences starts to teach you about the pieces that maybe you're the next piece you're ready for. And so you don't just make essences because you decide to make essences. You make essences when the plant asks you to, or signals some sort of openness to do so. And for me, that's been such an interesting thing because, I started out, very excited about making essences, and I'd be like wanting to connect with a particular plant, and they just would be like, not yet. Nope, not today, not yet. And you have to, when you're choosing to interact with nature on this conscious level, you have to be able to take a no. You have to be able to, have your desires thwarted. It has to be a consensual relationship from both parts. And then when you do get the yes, it can be really astonishing what will come forward. Um, do you have thoughts on the yes no process?
Yeah, it's not just about the plant too. It's about everything. It's about the weather. It's about the other outside forces that may come up that day. And so it has to kind of be this perfect storm of the weather, the plant calling, and your ability to actually go out there outside and do it, and have everything ready to go for that opportune time, all your supplies and everything. And if you're working, many of the essences are blooming around this. Many of the things that we make flower essences from bloom around the same time. So you may go out to the garden or into nature, and there may be several things calling your attention at once. And so that's another aspect. It's like, well, which one? And, I look to, you really have to get that sense of feeling into it. I may have in my mind been really wanting to make this certain flower essence for a long time, but then I get out there and there's something else growing around it that's actually calling even louder. And so, I have to release that attachment to what I wanted to do and go with what nature is showing me and telling me. And a really good way to determine that is to see what the insects are doing, what the birds are doing. I see, if I see a like bees really pollinating, or putting a lot of attention on this one particular plant, or maybe I notice, I get out there, I'm looking around, I'm trying to get a feel, and I see a hummingbird just swoop in and it goes into the plant. It's like, to me, that, or a butterfly, to me it's nature helping me to decide. It's helping to point me in the right direction. And so it's developing that practice of mindfulness, to just feel into it with your senses, and then watch what's happening and take your cues from nature and the plants part of that process. I mean, the plants releasing pheromones and telling the insects to come, or it's not like it's just all connected, and it's all part of that communication process.
Well, then there's that perfect moment, and where that plant is just in that state, and I love that you're talking about that other aspects of animal nature connecting and recognizing that this is a peak moment right now. And so, yeah, I too have had hummingbird visitations where they'll just stand and stare at me like, hey, hey. It's really intriguing when you start listening to the other voices of nature helping to guide you along which direction. And yeah, so many times I think I'm going for one thing and it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is the thing I'm actually here for. And then you have to sort of reverse engineer your day, or even the night before, or even days before, where you start to look for a pattern of things that are happening internally with you. Certainly when you're on your way to making an essence, or that morning of, you're already in that state. You're outside of the time of when the bowl gets laid out. These things are happening um, in this numinous state. It's very different than normal waking reality.
Yeah, and that's where I liken it to shamanic practices, because it's a non-ordinary reality, or an altered state of consciousness that is made up of this non-ordinary perception, and a non-duality state of knowing, which is where you might call it claircognizance, where you start to connect into just knowing what the right flower is, the right time is, and knowing what the plant is telling you. And the experiences run the gamut. I mean, some plants I've had weak experiences and not a lot came through. And then some were likened, they were so strong, it was almost psychedelic, and um with the visions or uh, being pulled into a real journey with that plant. And then sort of everything in between. And part of that, I think part of the practice for me, like when we call it like a spiritual practice, or um, it's not, it's also setting the container. So when I sit down with the plant, I in a conscious way, I like to call the directions, and really not just the four directions, but above and below and within. So like there's a 7 points of a container that is around me and the plant. And I like to do that consciously as part of a ritual, part of the ritual of working with that plant. And I find that really helps to get me onto the right level. Like the plant doesn't need it, but I need it. And I need it to settle into that space and to allow that information to come, and to allow that conversation to happen, to get into the right frequency. And in order to get out of my head, sometimes I'll sit there and sing or hum, or, just do whatever comes up to, uh, to get out of the head, just anything that comes up, whether, and I find that singing is a really nice, it's a really nice way to get into that space. And I always have a journal, so I'm always writing whatever happens and how I'm feeling. I may have residual emotional emotions that are just from something that just happened right before I sat down with the plant. And I think that's part of it. I make note of it, because I think that's what's coming in for healing. So even though we have these like really personal experiences making essences, where I feel like this, I wonder, okay, was this message and this healing just for me, or is this for everybody? Would I use it the same way for other people? And that's a question that comes up a lot, and people ask that about making essences. And I feel like it's not an either or. It's like an yes. It's both. And that when you're thinking about synchronicities and how everything is connected, then healing and working with my issue or emotions or experience is helping others, and that plant is doing both, and that experience that I'm having is the message that helps others as well. And I'm not sure if I'm articulating that. What do you think?
It's I think that's absolutely right. I think anytime that you are working through things on an internal level with in your own process, it ripples outwards, right? So we know that people that we have intimate friendships and relationships with are impacted by the changes that we experience. And we can certainly see just even people that randomly interact with us will shift based on what shifts we're having. And I know that certainly in the essence making experience, I've certainly seen other people react in very odd or distinctive ways that are not typical for them. They're just people who just happen to be randomly interacting with me as I'm, going to make essences or have just made essences. You'll start to see these kind of funny little artifacts. And so they're in the field too. They've interacted in the field too. So I agree with you that there is a broader than just me kind of experience, even when you make essences, intending them for your own healing. And I think that's a really legitimate reason to connect with plants, is because you have a specific need that, nature wants to help with. I don't think everyone needs to make an essence with the intention that it's, to heal the world or to, do, sort of a bigger intention. I think the plants are really happy to meet with you one on one to help work for you, to help work with you. So I don't think there's anything less than when you're making essences for yourself or for your family. I think that that's a beautiful way of working with plant medicine. In the years I've been making essences, I've had so many kind of notable or remarkable experiences, and I thought I'd kind of share a couple of them because it's interesting to just, sort of explain a few examples of what happens when you make essences. One of the really dramatic experiences that I remember of making essences was working with the purple sage. And this plant is really it's well known in Chinese medicine, and has been, used for millennia as an herb. And when I was interested in working with this as an essence, I was this was early on in making essences, and I kind of went up to the plant, and I sat down with my little notebook and was trying to be really studious about making notes about what the plant looked like and the textures and the flower formation. And I'm not discarding that that's a useful thing to do because it is. But when I kind of finally looked up and actually kind of gazed into the eyes of the plant, meeting the plant, it was just so the voice came through so strongly. It's like, "Well, now that you've described me, would you like to hear what I have to say?" And I realized, like, "Oh my god, what an ass I've been." It's as if I walked up to somebody at the airport and I started making notes about their clothing or something, and like, what a interesting hairstyle they have, and never actually greeted them as an individual. And so it's sort of like so often I've experienced, the plants sort of set me back on my little human tush of like, hello, we're here too, we're conscious too. Don't forget you're not interacting with an it, you're interacting with a them. So that was a kind of a funny experience that sort of kind of took me aback, like, oh, my bad, sorry. And so I apologized and sort of and went, okay, well, I'm here for this purpose and I'm hoping that you can help me. And the plant just sort of launched right in, because this is a plant who knows very well how to work with humans. It was just astonishing the level of consciousness that I was interacting with. And that's not every plant by any means, but this was a particularly dramatic experience. Have you had an experience of the plant sort of surprising you in a way?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said it doesn't happen with all plants and every time, because I don't want people to try this and think, oh, I'm doing it wrong, or I must not be good enough to do this. I mean, I've made well over 100 essences, and I still have times where it's just, I don't know, I'm not really getting that much, it's just for whatever reason. And, um, and then there's other times where it's sort of shocking, like how strong it is. And I know that the first time I made a redwood essence and worked with redwood, and I was setting that intention and the, ritual, and asking Gaia help, connect me to the spirit of redwood. And then I just felt the redwood be like, kind of like, you don't need that. I'm going to help you connect to Gaia. And so, and it sort of took me into this journey down into, the center of the earth, and to meet Gaia, and um, to have this whole experience. And so this redwood acted as this portal, and this catalyst. And it's like I didn't need to ask a deity to connect to the spirit. I was right there. The spirit was connecting with me. And it's just funny that it was kind of just taking charge like that. And I I thought, wow, it sets your preconceived notions to the side. And and go with it. And there's other experiences where I've had them pull me into these like spontaneous plant spirit journeys in a completely other reality. And there's been times where, like I said, it's just sort of it's nice. It's a nice experience. I'm getting a few snippets of information, but it's very mild. There's no real like deep strong connection like that, or loud communication. And so it's really interesting to like compare notes. So, which ones have you heard the loudest?
Every plant has a personality. Every even across the family, they'll tend to have similarities in personality. But I've certainly experienced, just like you say, plenty of times where I feel very drawn to making an essence. I feel like it's very clear that that's the right thing to do. And the minute you sort of open up the bowl and you put it out and you start sitting with it, it's like you get nothing. Or you might get, feeling, or you might get, something really minor and you're just like, am I doing anything here? Is anything happening here? And so you just kind of roll with it and just, okay, this is just this particular process on this day of this plant, and the next time you go back and attune to the plant to get more information, you might get a lot. Or you might get the same thing where it's not much. And it's part of the process of learning kind of the language of the plants. Some of them speak in very strong personalities and some of them don't. And so they all have, it's all kind of like voices in the choir, and some are very quiet and some are really loud. So don't, if you're interested in making essences yourself, like don't assume that you're doing it wrong because you're not getting this, or that you're not getting things far away. Like I tend to get pretty clear messages that I can kind of translate into written language. But some people are really, they feel it very much in their bodies. Some people, it's really all over the map. And so don't make assumptions about the way that you should get information, or that you're not, you can't do it because you don't get it in a particular way. I would encourage anybody to start trying and learning how you get information, how you might connect to plants, and they'll start talking to you. They'll start, if you take time. Now, I've never been the sort of person who can just kind of like, blast on past a plant and have them kind of grab me by the collar and start talking to me. That's never been what worked for me. I always had to be pretty quiet and slow down and, don't check your phone. And you kind of have to be with it and be with the boring, in order to start getting messages to come through. And one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is there are some plants that I've worked with that, particularly the really ancient ones, like the magnolias, that they're almost coming from a time before. Well, they're coming from a time that's very much before mine. They've been here for millions of years, and so like this whole word language thing is kind of like a new language for them, and they can help you, but sometimes it's much deeper than words and language. And so they've really given me a perspective of time, of, eons. Like they've seen things come and go. They've they're not so wrapped up in this human time frame, which we, as humans, we can only see things through our own eyes. But having the plants, we have the opportunity to see things from different and longer cycle eyes. Does that make sense to you, where you've worked with the redwoods and they can talk to you about millennia passing?
Yeah, so what I that is one of the things I notice with the redwoods so much because of their ancientness. They have this energy of having the long view. They have so much perspective, and what humanity is just a blip on the radar of their existence. And so they really have a different energy. And I in general, I have felt it harder to connect to trees in general than plants. It when I started making essences, it took me a while to just a bit of a different vibration. I feel like there's a different frequency that's happening, and the bigger and the older the thing, the 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 more difficult it was for me personally anyway to get on that wavelength. And so rocks and crystals and trees, especially the older trees, just took a little more time and effort, whereas working with herbs was like almost immediate. And of course, having that background in herbalism and already having worked with the herbal world for so long, that was a really natural way to begin for me. So I feel like starting out, it it's probably easier to start with plants that humans have been working with for a really long period of time, like medicinal herbs, and or plants that are just ubiquitous roadside weedy type plants, that they're just sort of here with humans and part of our landscape. Um, they and they're very, if they're like an invasive weed, I mean, they have a strong personality, and so it might be easier to connect with them. Yeah, that's a really good way to start.
It's an interesting idea. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody talk about, the difference between trees and sort of herbs or small, smaller plants in that way. But I think you're right. I think that there's something to that, that there, and it's certainly I agree that herbs are so twinned, so paired with us. They're so aware of our needs, and that they've shown up for us, that they definitely are, pretty much, they're not a hard one to get in touch with. They're not a hard one to work with, and they're generally quite loquacious and willing to tell you what they'd like to share with you. So yeah, that would be a good starting place, is to work with the herbs that you have growing in your garden, because they already know you and they already want to be part of your experience. I like that idea a lot. Um, yeah, and I think one thing that might be fun to talk about a little bit would be to talk about sort of some of the shadow stuff that can come up when you are making essences or when you're working with essences, because, and it is maybe a bit of a turn from what we were just talking about, where the herbs, generally they're human helpers. They're if you're talking about more the tonic herbs, they tend to be more gentle. They tend to be more sort of supportive and helping to, they're not catalytic or heroic kinds of herbs for the most part that we're talking about right now. But there are things that do have those sort of heroic qualities. And I'm speaking that in the term of herbalism, where um, it's a dramatic herb. It can be toxic. But not all plants that bring up shadow as essences are toxic plants. But it can be really wild to have your first sort of shadow threshold experience when you're working with essences and essence plants. Do you want to share one, or do you want me to jump into one that I could talk about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would just say that plants that have a cleansing action herbally, or spiritually, like some of the sages, for example, I feel like they can really, really work you with a sort of going deep, cleansing experience. When we learn about flower essences as well, I know in David Dalton's trainings and some other trainings looking at the plant signatures, and we look at that in our school as well. We always look at like the shape of the flower, and there's sort of clues about that in the ones that have these long, um, deep necks, can take you deeper subconsciously, and sometimes those are ones that work with shadows. So there's some clues, and I'll let you speak more about that. But um, when we talk about working with shadows, just what are we like? What we mean is, I like to just say it's facing things you don't want to face, just to put it simply, right? And not make it this esoteric, like, oh, we're doing shadow work. What is it's just it's something that you've been ignoring that you don't want to look at. And sometimes the plants that you work with will kind of force the issue. They'll bring it up for you to look at. And you know, you can't keep ignoring it. And so I think that's in general what how I look at it.
Yeah, good description, because it is very much, it's a challenging process. I mean, making essences, it will just, you know, turn you inside out. If you're really working intentionally and for a period of time with essences, you're gonna get some wild rides. I know that I've certainly experienced some myself, and my primary teacher, Jane Bell, talks about it a lot, where when she and Steve Johnson were out making essences out in the wilds in Alaska, like, stuff comes up. Really gnarly stuff comes up, and you just have to have on one hand, sort of be in the experience, let it move through, take notes, but also recognizing, like, oh, we're making an essence now. This is happening as part of this process, and it's informing, ways in which this essence is helpful and useful. I know that when she and I did an essence making trip to Hawaii, we made the night blooming cereus from her Hawaiian line. And oh my God, that is hardcore. That essence is it's a terrestrial, it's a cactus. It's a type of cactus, and it grows up in trees, almost like a vine. And it's really can be gigantic, and it blooms right around the full moon, and the flowers are these huge, night blooming, 10 inches across, huge white flowers. And making that essence was like, both of us had the heebie-jeebies the whole time, and we were just sort of like, freaking out randomly, and, going out to be with the plant and the flowers. We're getting dive bombed by giant bats and stuff. And then there's things crawling in the underbrush, and we were both, trying not to shriek the whole time. It was crazy. And, you're going through a process, but it's also still happening. You're experiencing it. And that essence is such a powerful, sort of shadow illuminator. It shows you all of your fears. It shows you all of the things that you know, in order to grow and become who we are supposed to be, we have to look down the barrel of that and go, okay, this is terrifying and upsetting and scary. But here I am. And I'm going to choose to open up to be bigger than that, and to embrace this process that I'm going through, and to embrace, like, the gold that comes through walking through that wild, terrifying, exhilarating process.
What a great story. I mean, yeah, facing your fears, right? I mean, how intense is that? And it's funny. I tell people that, it's not all, sunshine and light and love making flower essences. It can really just bring things can happen where you have to face either fears or emotions come up, or all of a sudden some situation happens that you have to deal with, and it is so part of that process. It's like the plants are showing you in this really literal way, um, what it's where its healing lies. And I mean, I made a seaweed essence last summer, and this is, the funny story about that is, I had this, amazing, um, really lovely meditative experience, at low tide with this rainbow leaf seaweed. And um, it was the first time I had tried to make a seaweed essence. And so it was all a new experience, and um, very cool. But then as I was like leaving the beach, and I was getting that the essence was about cleansing, right? But as I was walking away out of the leaving the beach, I stepped in dog poop. So, and it was interestingly, it was like hidden because someone had like kicked some sand over it. So, it was like, and it was smelly and it was messy and it got into the crevices of my grippy, keen sandals. And I tried to scrape it off with a stick before I walked further. And then when I had to like figure out how to wash them off or put them in a bag before I put them in my car. Like it was this whole thing. It was this whole, you know, process that like I won't say it ruined the experience of making the essence. It was part of the experience of making the essence because it was telling me like so literally about how cleansing that essence is and how detoxifying it is. And it's funny too. It's just like one of those things. It happens.
Yeah, there's a lot of it happens when you're making essences. You just track it all, and everything is worthy of making a note about. And when you are making essences, and you know, Ro, you and I, we've been talking about this whole, in preparation for the podcast, and that we'd really like to create a community. We're thinking about coming up with an offering through the fluorescence studies of a cohort of sort of essence making as a spiritual journey, probably this coming spring, of people who want to start working with essences together, and talking about their experiences and making essences together, and having this whole experience, because it's really the growth that happens is amazing. And it's also really nice to be able to do it in group, to be able to have these conversations with one another, like this crazy thing happened, and then somebody will tell you, oh yeah, that happened to me too. Rather than just being so isolated, like a lot of us are, of not really realizing that this is an experience that we can share, that we can talk about in a safe place. So that's something that we're contemplating. So if you're listening and you're like, oh, that's me, I want to be part of that, let us know. We would love to bring together a group of people of kind hearts and open to nature, who want to work very intentionally with this as an inner growthful process. And there's also this thing about when you make essences, you really want to have that affirmation that, oh yes, this is right, this is really happening, something's really happening. Because like you say, if you're doing it alone, you're like, I'm not even sure anything's in this bottle. I can't tell you how many conversations that I've had with Jane when we make essences is like, is this anything? And then you hand it to someone and they're just like, whoa, that is so powerful. This doubt, this like, is something happening here? It is pretty much, as far as I can tell, it's universal to the essence making process. So you are not alone, and we want you to not feel alone if you make essences and you doubt yourself, because been there, done that. Everybody I know has been there and done that. So
Yeah, I think it would be so fun to get a group of people together, sharing our experiences about making essences and going through that process, together. Be a fun journey and a fun experience. So yeah, if you're listening and you're interested in something like that, we're just trying to gauge interest and see who might be up for that for next spring. And you could email us at hello@floweressencestudies.com and with your thoughts. That would be cool.
thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing this time with us, talking about the experiences of making flower essences, of working directly with nature and her gifts for us. We really appreciate your listening to us, and sharing your time on a regular basis. It's so fun to hear from you podcast listeners. We really love to hear that you're hearing us, because it's, Ro and I, we just kind of do this thing and we put it out, and sometimes we really don't realize who is connecting. So we do love to hear from you. It makes us so happy when we get, the mails or the comments, and if should you feel inspired to offer, a few stars and a review on your podcast catcher, we'd be so grateful. So thank you so much for playing along, and we look forward to our next interaction with you.